Well, hi. Great to be with you again this morning. I hope that you can hear me. I was unable to hear the Mishkan Katan intro, and that alarms me a little bit because normally I can hear it, but I'm hoping that you can hear me. If you can't hear me, then please make a comment in the comments section, and I will see what I can do about the situation. You never know with technology, right? So I've been gone for a while. You've been studying Thessalonians with me in pre-recorded sessions. Before I left the country, I pre-recorded those 4 sessions on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and I hope those were a blessing to you. I have been in Israel, and accordingly, I thought today, with our time together, I would share with you a bit about my trip. I've taken now 3 trips to Israel, and each one of them has been really special and a tremendous blessing. If you have never gone, then I would strongly recommend that you make it a priority to go. You don't have to go with a great big tour. I'm about to tell you about my 3 trips and how I went, and they're a good illustration of the three different ways you can go. Probably my favorite way to go is the way I went on my first trip. This was in 2018. I actually went twice that year. I went at the end of January into early February, stayed about 9 days. I went with my childhood girlfriend and her nephew. The 3 of us went. She is an attorney and had business over there. So I just asked if I could tag along with her and her nephew, and she said graciously, of course. So what we did was we went onto one of those Airbnb, VRBO type sites, and we booked an apartment in a conservative Jewish section of Jerusalem. It's in the Muzrara community, if you've ever heard of that. I doubt you have. I hadn't, but it's not at all far from the Jaffa Gate into the old city. So it was a very convenient location. We were surrounded by very highly conservative Hasidic Jews, and it was just a great experience. And in conjunction with that, we booked our own airfare, of course, and I paid for mine with credit card miles. And so that kept it cheaper. Then we hired our own tour guide for that trip, a wonderful Arabic Christian man who's just, I think, the best tour guide in Israel. And he specializes in this type of experience where you just hire him and his car, and he piles you into his car and takes you wherever you want to go. And he's native born. He was born in the old city of Jerusalem and has lived there his entire life. So that's one way to go. And we saw all kinds of wonderful sights on that trip. It was a very fun, it was like touring. It was like touring with friends, which is what it was. Then the second time I went with Barry K. Seif, who some of you may know. She's married to Jeffrey Seif. And Dr. Jeffrey Seif is one of the major players in bringing about the Tree of Life Bible, one of the newer translations. At any rate, Barry K. has taken people to Israel for years and years. And she typically takes a group of about 15 people, which is a very great size of group to go with. And so I went with Barry Kay and some new friends on that trip. And the purpose of that trip was to serve the people of Israel. And that's what we did. We visited hospitals. We visited children's wards. We brought blankets for the NICU unit, incubators, and toys for the children. We brought over bathrobes and other comfort items for Holocaust survivors. We worked on farms. It was just a great service trip. And if that's your desire, then I highly recommend Barry Kay. Her outfit is called Sar Shalom Israel, and you can find her on Facebook, Sar Shalom Israel. And she does a wonderful job. And then this third time, I went with a group of Messianics to study. This was truly a study tour. And as an overview, we did a study of various sites that are mentioned in the Old Testament, and we saw a lot of sites. We interacted deeply with conservative Jews. And so, without any further ado, let me just give you a day-by-day rundown of the trip. And we'll get as far as we can get today. And if we get all the way through, that's great. If we don't, then I'll continue next week. All right, so day one, we left on early on a Sunday morning, June 4th. And I had to be at the pickup location to meet the shuttle van at 4:30 a.m., which of course is ungodly, but at any rate, it was what it was. And I'm so grateful to my friends Ken and Slowania, who routinely get up at that time of day. He does anyway for his job. And so he said, hey, I'll spare your sweet husband the obligation, and Slowania and I will come get you and take you to meet the van. So they did. And I'm so grateful for that. Our flight out of Atlanta left at 9:15 that Sunday morning, and we got there in plenty of time. We chose not to do a direct flight, which I've promised myself and told my husband that if I ever decide to go back to Israel, then I am going to take a direct flight. I'm not going to do any more of these things where I do these layovers, because it's just too problematic. The direct flight's about a 14-hour flight, point A to point B. There's no layover. There's no situation like what happened to us in Montreal. So we had a layover in Montreal, and it was supposed to be a 4 to 5 hour layover, which is bad enough in itself. We flew Air Canada, and in Montreal, Air Canada had a problem with a door sensor on our plane. And instead of having a 4 to 5 hour layover, it was approximately a 10-hour layover, which cheated us out of some of our time in Tel Aviv, which was problem one. And of course, it just absolutely wore us out. So I would strongly recommend, if you're flying to Israel, and when you fly to Israel, you fly into Tel Aviv. It's just the way that it's done. So I would strongly recommend a direct flight if you can get it. Now, I live around the Atlanta, Georgia area, so that was no problem. That would be no problem for me. But, if you live in, I don't know, the outer reaches of Timbuktu or wherever, I would strongly recommend driving to the nearest airport where you can get a direct flight. It's just really worth it. It's really worth it. Most of the flights leave out that are direct. They leave out on the East Coast because that's just closer to your destination. You've got about a 6,000 mile difference between where I live and where Israel is. So it's halfway around the world, more or less. All right. So we got into Tel Aviv, and we got there at it was nearly 6:30 p.m. by the time we got to our hotel. So we were worn out. We were hungry. We had a delicious dinner, our first meal of that delicious Israel food. Now, I think it's delicious. My good friend Jenny's not so much of a fan, but hey, it doesn't bother me at all to have pickled herring for breakfast, tuna salad for breakfast, hummus with fresh vegetables for breakfast, salad for breakfast, plus things like shakshuka, boiled eggs, cheese blintzes and other pastries, juices, coffee. It's just magnificent food. It's healthy food. And you know what? I'll tell you, I lose weight every time I go there, which is a good thing for me, in case you haven't noticed. But at any rate, yeah, the 3 times I've been, I've lost weight every single time. And I think it's because the food is healthier. And I didn't, do some kind of weird diet or anything any of the times I went over there. Like this time, I had dessert at practically every meal. Halva with breakfast, which halva is it's a tahini and sugar dessert. Basically, it's high in protein, but it's got a lot of sugar in it. And so there you go. By the way, let me say this. What I'm sharing with you today is I'm sharing the blog posts that I wrote while I was in Israel. And as you can see, going there. I have a blog, resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com. And I blogged every day of the trip except the first travel day. I combined day 1 and day 2 because you really lose a day going over there. We left early on Sunday morning and we got there on Monday afternoon late. So you essentially lose at least a day going over there. And in our case, we lost almost 2 days because of the mess up in Montreal. But then every other day, at the end of the day, I sat down with my little iPad and I typed out my recollections of the day because each day was so action packed. If I hadn't done that, I would have forgotten what we did. And the same thing with the pictures. I posted on my Facebook page, Resplendent Daughter Ministries. I posted the blog posts. So if you're a Facebook fan, go there to my page and read them there. And I also, in separate posts, I posted my pictures keyed by day. So you'll see, it's just day 1's not a good one because I don't think I took any pictures on day 1. But at any rate, day 2, you'll see the post and you'll see the pictures. So if you want to see the pictures about what I'm talking about, some of you are more visual than auditory, go there and see the pictures. Or I'll tell you what else you could do. As I go through talking about each day here at Mishkan, Katan in this broadcast, you can go to my Facebook page and just look at the pictures as we go, because I don't plan to show any pictures in this Mishkan, Katan broadcast. So that's another idea, just open another tab on your browser and or on your phone on a separate device and just look at the pictures as we go along. All right. So we went to bed after making a walk to the beach. We walked out to the beach that night because we weren't spending much time in Tel Aviv at all. We really only had 1 day. And because we got there so late, we really barely had that. One of my regrets for the people on the trip was that in Tel Aviv, we didn't go to the old city of Jaffa. It's really beautiful. It's kind of similar to Jerusalem, in that you've got the old city complex surrounded by gates and walls, and then you've got the city at large that surrounds it. Tel Aviv is sort of similar. You've got the old city of Jaffa, or Yaffo, as in the official language, and it's really beautiful. It reminds me a lot of Jerusalem. It's about the same, similar in time period. So, you've got the cobblestone, old stone streets and so on and so forth. But Yaffo has some beautiful parks, some beautiful things to see. So if you go, try to see the old city of Jaffa. It's a port city. The port is really beautiful. You've got the beach. Tel Aviv is a very cosmopolitan city. And I'm going to tell you more about that right now. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit, give you some stats about Israel. I've got a map here of Israel that I got at the Israel Museum. And you can see that Israel goes from all the way down here to the Red Sea. And it goes all the way up here to the Lebanese and Syrian border. Okay. And you've got Lebanon on up here, and Syria is kind of, I'm bad about doing things backward. Syria is up this way, and Lebanon is on up this way, and so you've got the seacoast over here. I'm bad at this, folks. And then you'll see here this mountain range, and Jerusalem. You find Jerusalem. Jerusalem is right here. It's up on the top of mountains, right? Up on the top of mountains. And then you've got the Dead Sea down here, the lowest point on the earth. And up here, you've got the Sea of Galilee, which is also below sea level. So what a fascinating country. Up here around Mount Hermon and these other mountains, you get snow. They have ski slopes in the winter. And once you come down off of the mountains on either side, you've got pretty much desert. So it's a country with a lot of varied climates, okay? About 9 million people live in Israel. There are about 6.5 million Jews. There are about 2.3 million Muslim Arabs. I know this is probably bothering you. It's bothering me, all right? Let me see if I can get this straight and hold it still. Okay. Y'all, I'm sorry. I'm such a spaz. All right. It's got 2.3 million Muslim Arabs. And then you've got Christian Arabs. There's about 120 to 150,000 of those. Okay. This is an interesting fact. I'm going to move that. It's probably driving you nuts. About 85% of the population of Israel lives in apartments. Apartments. They're not many single freestanding homes. Those are only for the very rich. And the three largest cities are Jerusalem, which has around 1 million people. And the majority of people who live in Jerusalem are government workers, because that's the seat of government. And then the next largest city is Tel Aviv. And most of your professional people live in Tel Aviv. And then Haifa is the third largest city in Israel. And Haifa and Mount Carmel, or Mount Carmel, are right there together. Part of Haifa is on Mount Carmel. And that's where you find mostly your blue-collar workers. Haifa is another port. Tel Aviv, here we go again. Tel Aviv is right here on the coast, all right? And Haifa is right up here. So Tel Aviv and Haifa, okay? So Haifa is another port city, and it's an industrial port city. So there are a lot of blue-collar workers in Haifa. Now, Tel Aviv means hill of spring. Tel, the word tel, is an ancient Hebrew word which meant hill or mountain or mound. It was a word that didn't really differentiate according to size or shape of the hill or mound. So you could have a huge high mountain and still call it a tel, or you could have a little mound the size of an Indian mound and still call it a tel. All right. So Tel Aviv means hill of spring. And so on our first full day in Israel, we left Tel Aviv behind. We just spent one night there. And our first stop, after traveling through the area known as Netanya, which means, what does it mean? Where am I in my notes? Good grief, I've lost my place. It means gate of God. Okay, Netanya means gate of God. We went through Netanya and we arrived at what's called Caesarea by the Sea. You might know it as Caesarea. Caesarea. It's an Israeli national park and a beautiful place to visit. This was the second time I've been to Caesarea. The first time I went was my second trip to Israel. And so we spent a lot of time there. And getting there, we also traveled through Megiddo. And Megiddo is a plain near the Jezreel Valley. And I'll tell you more about those in just a little bit. All right, so Caesarea. Now, Joppa was the first deep water port in modern Israel. And Joppa was what was there before modern day Tel Aviv was built. But Herod the Great, King Herod the Great, built the deep water port at Caesarea. He built it with Roman concrete. Now, I found this so fascinating. Roman concrete contains a yeast which heals itself of cracks and such. It's a far superior product to more modern concrete, and it has taken scientists long decades to have recently discovered this yeast component, which heals itself. I know that sounds crazy. It heals itself of cracks and such. And so he used this Roman yeast concrete, and he used it to make the pillars, and he sunk them into the ocean and this and that. And in addition to scooping out this deep water port there at Caesarea, he also built a hippodrome there. He built hippodromes not only in Caesarea, but he also built them elsewhere. He was a tremendous architect and builder. You know, if you've not studied Herod the Great, he had his flaws. He was a little bit crazy. Well, no, I take that back. He was a lot crazy, but he was a crazy genius. I have taught teachers how to teach gifted individuals. And the party line in the textbooks for training gifted teachers is that the more gifted a person is, has no effect on how eccentric they might be. No effect. I'm here to tell you that is not true. That is not true. Most of your highly gifted people are also at least a little bit eccentric. And in some cases, they're downright off the wall crazy, as was Herod the Great. He was also very ambitious, very ambitious. So more about that in a minute. But he built these hippodromes. He also built outdoor theaters, like an outdoor amphitheater. And he also came up with this modern day, as we thought it was modern day, concept of first, second, and third place winners. Did you know that originated with Herod the Great? Yes, it did. It was instituted by Herod at Caesarea. Caesarea was the center of Roman life in Judea in the late century before Christ and in the first century Common Era. And Caesarea was built after Herod found himself on the losing side of a battle for the emperorship in 31 BCE. He had been supporting Mark Antony. You probably have heard that name before, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But Mark Antony lost that battle for the emperorship. And oh, excuse me, I'm still recovering from jet lag, y'all. I'm not bored, I promise you. The new emperor was named Octavianus, and Octavianus became Herod the Great's new master. In order to prove his loyalty, Herod knew he had to do something spectacular. So he went to see Octavianus, and he pledged his fealty and hoped that at that meeting, Octavianus would not say, "Off with your head." His wife, Herod's wife, really thought that was what would happen. And while he was gone, she began making plans for one of their two sons to to ascend to the throne, because she just knew that he was going to not come back from that meeting. But for whatever he said at that meeting with Octavianus, Octavianus was sufficiently convinced that Herod would at least deserve a second chance, so he didn't decide to kill him right away. So, in order to prove his loyalty, Herod built this deep water port, and he named it after the emperor. That's why Caesarea, he named it after the new emperor Octavianus, and he dedicated it to him and invited him to the dedication. And there was much rear end kissing going on, as you might imagine. So even though he was an architectural genius, he was not exactly admired by those closest to him. So when he got home, triumphant from his meeting with the new emperor, he was told that his wife had been making these plans to have one of his sons succeed Herod, and so he had her killed right off the spot. Well, that didn't make him exactly popular with their two sons. And about 10 years later, he realized that the two sons were plotting against him to overthrow him, in part because, he'd killed their mother. And so he had them tried and put in prison, and not too long after that, put to death also. Well, about 5 years after the son's death, the Caesarea port project was complete. And if this strikes you as rather barbaric, well, it was. Like I said, he was a bit of a lunatic, but one of his contemporaries said that it would be better to be a pig in Herod's household, because Herod was Jewish, at least in theory, and he kept kosher. He ate kosher. So, a pig would be safe in Herod's household, but not his wife and sons. So he was quite a piece of work, Herod the Great. Well, we explored Caesarea thoroughly. We visited there, for example, the ruins of the only Mithraeum excavated in Israel. Now, what is that, you're probably asking? Well, in the early 2nd century CE, one vault was converted into a Mithraeum, a vault there at Caesarea. A Mithraeum is a structure whereby you make a hole in the ceiling. It's a strategically determined hole in the ceiling so that a shaft of sunlight will come down into the ceiling, and it will illuminate an altar there in the room. And all of this was done. The reason it's called a Mithraeum is that there was a cult known as the cult of Mithras, Mithras, if you're wanting to know how to spell it. Mithras was a sun god, all right? And Mithras was known as the unconquered sun, right? And only men were allowed into this Mithraeum. They came to be called fathers. And all the temples to Mithras faced east because the sun rose there. And now you may be thinking, well, in Judaism, Jews pray facing east. But now, wait a minute. Let's be careful about this. If you're an American Jew, you pray facing east because you pray facing Jerusalem. But a lot of the time when we prayed on this trip, we prayed facing south. Why? Because we pray, as Jews, we pray facing the temple. The temple. So be careful and make sure you understand this. The cult of Mithras, they prayed facing east because that's where the sun rose. The sun always rises in the east, okay? But Jews and Messianic Jews, typically when they're saying the prayers from the Sidurs, the Sidurim, they pray facing east because if they're in America, Jerusalem is in the east. Okay, enough about that. All right, but all the temples to Mithras faced east because the sun rose there. And listen to this now. Mithraism became the religion of the Roman soldier, sun worship. The first Christmas was celebrated in 310, around the time of the birthday of Mithras. Mithras' birthday was December 25th. Did you hear what I said? Mithras' birthday, the sun god, was December 25th. All right. Whew. While at the Mithraeum, we heard teaching on the original Christians, the Nazarenes, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua HaMashiach, Yeshua the Messiah. Sometimes these people were called people of the way. The Nazarenes were a first century CE group, and they sort of dropped off the historical radar in many cases. The most important associations between the Jewish believers and Caesarea has to do with Constantine's biographer, a guy named Eusebius of Caesarea, who in this role became privy to many ancient religious writings and indeed was the custodian of them. The earliest followers of Yeshua were Torah observant believers. We know, for instance, that James, the half-brother of Jesus, issued orders for Paul and others to take a Nazirite vow regarding the circumcision issue that is mentioned in the book of Acts. After James the Just, the next 14 bishops of the Way, the Nazarenes, were similarly Torah observant. And the one right after James the Just was Shimon bar Yonah, Simon bar Jonah. And I'll talk more about Simon Peter, as he's often called, later on as I unroll this trip to you. However, the 16th bishop of the Way was a Roman. His name was Marcus. And when Marcus came in around 135 CE, everything that was Jewish about the Christian faith came to be wiped out from the city of Jerusalem. And this Mithraism began to creep in because Mithraism was the religion of the Roman soldier and the Romans at large. The Jews were forbidden to go back into Jerusalem except on the day called Tisha B'Av, which became to be a I don't want to call it a holiday. It's a very sad day, but it's the day on the calendar that marks the date that the temples were destroyed. A fact that is not commonly known is that both the first and the second temples were destroyed on the same day, the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. And when Jews were allowed to go back into the city on the 9th of Av, what they saw was pigs running through the streets and all manner of pagan defilements everywhere they looked. So the deal was that the main center of what you might call Nazarene Christianity shifted from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Eusebius had a bias. He discussed areas in his writings that he should not have talked about, and he omitted some stuff that was much more important that he did not talk about. But the point is that this switch to a Roman bishop of Jerusalem led to the official Catholic history and flight path, trajectory, going forward from Caesarea. Because again, Caesarea was the Roman hub in Judea of that day. So also at Caesarea, another place we visited, we could see in the distance near the shore a large power plant. Now, this complex produces 25% of the drinking water in Israel. There's much drought in this land. There's a rainy season that extends from roughly October through roughly March, and the majority of Israel's rain comes during that time. But about 5 years ago, several desalination plants were built. And now, because of that, water is plentiful in Israel. Water is taken from the Mediterranean, it's taken from the Sea of Galilee, and it's desalinated. And now the water in the Sea of Galilee is fresh water, but the water from the Med is salt water. And so these plants take the salt out of the water, they purify it, and water is plentiful in Israel. It's wonderful, potable drinking water. It tastes good. And that only happened about 5 to 6 years ago. So that had just happened when I came to Israel for the first time. And in fact, Israel now exports potable drinking water to Jordan. There's a guy in Jericho who has a bottled water plant, and he wrote a book called Once an Arafat Man. His testimony is incredible. One thing, if you know me at all, you know that I'm terrible with names. I cannot remember names to save my gizzard. But if you go to Amazon and you look for that book, Once an Arafat Man, you'll find his name. And I got to visit with him on my second trip in 2018 there in Jericho. He found the sites of some of the ancient wells there in the Jericho area, and he revitalized those wells, and now he sends bottled water all through Israel. So what a blessing. It's an example of how the Lord God is making the desert bloom. Isn't that awesome? He's making the desert bloom. All right, so we got to see those plants, and I believe I have a picture of that in my pictures if you want to go see that. And next there at Caesarea, we went to stand in the ruins of the palace of Herod Agrippa. Now, this is a different Herod. This is not Herod the Great. Herod Agrippa is the Herod before whom Paul stood in Acts 24:17. Agrippa, of course, came after Herod the Great. So Paul came to bring offerings to Caesarea, and he had an audience with Herod Agrippa, Acts 24:17. Now, Pontius Pilate, as you may recall, was the Roman prefect who presided over the sham trial of Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. And you can read about that in Matthew 27, verses 11 through 26. And there is a large monument fragment that's been unearthed in the ruins of Caesarea, and it has Pontius Pilate's name on it. So that serves to help cement his place through archaeology in human history. Not that we who believe the Bible need any further proof, but it's a great archaeological artifact, and you can see that on display in Caesarea. And then our next stop in Caesarea was a magnificent restored amphitheater. It's a Romanesque outdoor theater. It seats 3,000 people. It's been refurbished a little bit, and they have concerts there and so forth. It has amazing acoustics. And in the theater, in the sound box, is where King Agrippa the First made his famous speech in his splendid golden robe and did not give God the glory. And in just a few hours, a worm ate him from the inside, causing his death. Scripture tells us this. Now, Agrippa the first was the one who, met with the wise men, told them to come and tell him where the baby was, that this was born King of the Jews. And so from the time Yeshua was born till the time he went to the temple to be presented at the temple by his parents, during that time, the Holy Family went to Egypt and came back, and Herod was dead. Because, see, after Herod died, it was safe for them to come back from Egypt. But I'm getting off track here. So anyway, we left Caesarea and we journeyed north. We went through a town called Or Akiva, which means light of Akiva. And it's named after the very famous rabbi who was named Rabbi Akiva. He was a pioneer in educating people in the Talmud and the Torah. And he had over 24,000 students in his day. He was tortured and burned to death. And as he was dying, he said, "The parchments are burning, but the letters are flying up to the heavens." That's a pretty close approximation, if not an absolutely 100% perfect direct quote. But what he was saying is that his enemies could destroy the papyrus scrolls, but the letters and words from those scrolls resided in the hearts of his students, and no man could take those away or extinguish them. And so as we rode on through, our guide talked about the achievements of the Rothschild family. The Rothschilds have developed modern Caesarea in great deal, and they led the restoration efforts in the area. They also spent a lot of money on educational efforts in the area. Now, on the way to Megiddo, shortly before they got there, we went by the city of Nazareth and also Mount Tabor, where the transfiguration of Yeshua occurred, and also where the Battle of Deborah occurred. Recall that Deborah was a female judge who's talked about in the book of Judges. Now, regarding Megiddo and other major events and places, we tend to think of them only just as future or just as past, but truly they are both. There are prophecies that have been fulfilled already about these places, but there are also places that have unfulfilled prophecies waiting on God Almighty, our wonderful Father, to decree that it's time for those future prophecies to be fulfilled. Megiddo is one such place, and it's a tell. It's a tall mountain, and up there on Tel Megiddo, we saw several ancient structures. We saw a well, we saw a granary, we saw stables, and we saw a high place. Now, you may remember reading about pagan high places in the Old Testament and about how the judges and the kings could never seem to get rid of all of them. Well, these are called Bamot. Some of the Bamot were places dedicated to the worship of Israel's one true God, Adonai, Hashem. When the Mishkan was headquartered at Gilgal, for example, it was okay to worship Father Yahweh upon the high places. Later on, when the Ark of the Covenant was moved to Shiloh, that type of worship on the high places began to be forbidden. And that's something I learned on this trip to Israel, because I thought that all along, all worship on the high places was pagan and forbidden, but that's not so. In the early days, it was okay. And we saw one such high place. Now, what was the number of people in a chariot in ancient days? This sounds like a tremendously big jump somewhere else, and it is, but this is something we saw there at Tel Megiddo. Um, there were three people in a chariot. All right. One was the driver. He was the person who held uh, onto the reins. Okay. And then there was an archer. He was the one that shot the bow and arrow at the enemies. And then the third one is nicknamed the seatbelt. And he was in the back and he held on to the other two. And he had a shield on his back to protect himself from arrows, and a helmet, of course. But he was the seatbelt. He held on to the other two to stabilize them. And I thought that was interesting. And I have a picture demonstrating that if you go look at my pictures. But as we were on the top of Tel Megiddo, we looked out, and one of our rabbis on the trip spoke on the topic of gates. In Hebrew, the word is she'arim, the plural, gates. And Jacob, Yaakov, was the first to speak of the gates of heaven. The gate he spoke of was a vertical gate. Can you think of what I might be referring to? If you're thinking of Yaakov's ladder, Jacob's ladder, then yes, ding, 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 50 points for you. This is the first mention of such gates in the Old Testament, Jacob's ladder. And there were three Old Testament people who made radical changes in their lives through the power of God, as illustrated through gates. One was Moses. Jacob was another one, and Joseph was the third. Now, for example, some of you will be familiar with the Havdalah service that comes at the close of every Shabbat on Saturday night, and it's sometimes called the closing of the gate. When we enter into Shabbat on Friday evening, it's like going through a gate onto an island of rest and relaxation and rejuvenation and restoration. And then when we leave the Shabbat, it's like we pass out of another gate, and through Havdalah, we close that gate, and Shavua Tov, we start a new week. So one of the things that the rabbis have said is, may the gates of heaven always be open unto us. And so then we talked about the Nicanor gate a little bit, a very famous gate in the ancient Hebrew temple. Every morning in the tabernacle and later the temples, morning sacrifices were performed, the Tamid offerings. And there were 24 rings north of the altar inside the Nicanor gate. And the sacrifice would not take place until sunlight would touch the second ring of these 24 rings. And the Nicanor gate faced east in order for that to happen. Everything that happened in the ancient Jewish temple happened in a very scheduled and regimented fashion. So when you look down from Tel Megiddo to the Jezreel plain, you're flabbergasted at how huge that plain is. And this is the famous plain that is referred to as the location of the ancient Battle of Armageddon. And it's massive. I tried to take a picture of it. You can see that in my pictures, but I'm telling you, it doesn't begin to express how huge that plain is. From Megiddo, we went on north to the Haifa area. This was land that was given to the tribe of Zebulun when Joshua made the land distribution. At the time, the 12 tribes entered. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, excuse me. Listen. Last night, I went to bed at 8 o'clock, okay, trying to get enough rest for this broadcast. And I slept between 10 and 11 hours. So I don't know what's wrong with me. I guess jet lag is a booger bear. But anyway, going on. Haifa consumes the area from the top of Mount Carmel all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. And Haifa today is a very busy harbor, a center of industry, and it's also home to Haifa University. At the university is the Hecht, and that's spelled Hecht, the Hecht Museum. It's a smallish museum, but it has many ancient Israeli artifacts in it, and we visited it. And the main attraction that one of our rabbis on the trip wanted us to see was a section of one of the 8 domes that were inside of the double Huldah gate. And there were actually 8 of these domes inside this gate that's called Beautiful. That's another name for the Huldah gates, is the Beautiful Gate. It's a double gate, which means it had two arched openings, and you could go through either side. And there was also a triple gate on the southern wall of the temple complex, in addition to the double gate that I was referring to. Now, Huldah is not a person's name. Instead, it's basically a Hebrew word that means rodent. So, but the Huldah gate is the double gate on the southern wall of the temple. And these 8 domes inside the Huldah gate were made of limestone from Jerusalem. Limestone from Jerusalem is soft when it's quarried, but it hardens upon exposure to light and air. And some of the types of limestone quarried in Israel turn to powder at a certain temperature. And that is why some gates and some walls and so forth have endured, and other evidence has not. But the double Huldah gate, the Beautiful Gate, had 15 steps leading up to it. And that's where the common people entered the south wall into the temple. And the triple gate on that same southern face was for the priests and the Levites and the animals that were led through that opening. They were for the korbanot, or the burnt offerings. Now, the two gates on the south side of the temple wall were excavated by the very famous Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar in the late 1960s. And his daughter also went on to be a very famous archaeologist who died just 2 to 3 years ago. And as is my custom, I can't remember her name, but she also went on to be a wonderful archaeologist. But at any rate, these gates on the southern face of the temple were gorgeous. Few people living today that are not Muslim have seen these inside of these gates. The beauty of the gate is not on the outside, it's on the inside. When you walk through the gate and you look up and you see these big, beautiful murals on the domes, or how they used to be, and so forth. Of course, the gates that you see today are built above the actual ancient gates with the domes, because, civilizations build up on top of other civilizations. All right. But these gates were gorgeous. And in Ezekiel, we are told to learn every exit and every entrance to the temple. Why? Why exits and then entrances? Well, the order of those words was not accidental. The exit was more important than the entrance, because theoretically and hopefully you would exit through the gate a changed person. So the exit is more important than the entrance. Well, we left the Haifa University area after going up into a high tower onto the 31st story, and that gave us a magnificent view of the harbor area. And there's a cable car, sort of like the one in Stone Mountain in Georgia, that runs from the port area all the way up to the top of Mount Carmel to the university area. And it's a wonderful way to get from way down below the mountain all the way up to the top. There's a similar situation at Masada, a similar cable car also. Well, one of the rabbis on our trip told us about the Druze people who live in the Mount Carmel area. They believe that they're descended from Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, but they also think they're descended from the Chinese. They worship a very secretive religion, and most of the adherents to it never know all of their secrets of the religion that they worship. They're tremendous fighters, and most of them have huge mustaches and wear small white round hats that look a little bit like kippurim, like the Jewish kippah. The plural is kippurim. And they'll have little pom-poms on top of them. And I saw a news headline from Jerusalem Post this morning that the Druze up there in the Carmel area are very restless right now. It's at risk of becoming an intifada, which is not a good thing. They're uprising against the government. So let's pray that gets worked out and settled down. As for the Druze women, they bake a particular type of bread known as saj. And it's a very thin bread, thinner even than the American wrap, and it's rolled very thin and laid on the top of an inverted kettle where it bakes quickly. And I've tasted it before and got to taste it on this trip, and it's delicious to make your falafel wrap sandwiches and your shawarma and so forth. All right, so after we left Haifa, we journeyed an hour or so to our hotel destination in the middle Galilee. And we went to a kibbutz, first time I'd ever seen a kibbutz, called Kibbutz Levi off of Highway 77. The accommodations there are very nice, and we enjoyed being there very much. And it was our home base for the next 5 nights. And so that really is the end of our first real day, what I called in my blog, day 2. And unbelievably, my friends, we're just about out of time here. So I didn't really know how far I was going to get in telling you about my trip, but it seems I just got through really a couple of days. So this may go on for several sessions, but at any rate, thank you for tuning in today. If you have friends who want to watch this broadcast, they can watch it over the next 6 days here at the MessianicLambRadio.com. MessianicLambRadio.com. All they have to do is go to the tab that says Shows on Demand, scroll down to Wednesday at 11 o'clock, and they can find it here. I also have a YouTube channel. It's my first and last name, Genahood, Gina Hood, 2818. Gina Hood 2818. And if you'd like a print version of everything today, you can find it at my blog, resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com. Shalom, shalom, y'all.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.